Really excited to hear your story. Actually, share a lot of commonalities. We both went through the UC Universal California system, and we both went to Harvard for our master degrees, and we're both in Southeast Asia tech. Again, excited to hear your journey a little bit more.
Thank you,
And also, of
Jeremy.
course, we've heard something. Yeah, we've heard so many good things about you as well. Been out. Love for you to introduce yourself for those who don't know you yet.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy, and really grateful to be on the Brave podcast. My name is Todd Schweitzer. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Brankas. We're an open finance technology company operating across Southeast Asia. I myself am born and raised mostly in California, but I've been in Southeast Asia for 7 years now, mostly in Manila, Philippines, which has I think a market that is really taking off and has been an exciting place because in 2015, 2016, frankly, there wasn't a lot of startup activity. And now I think the Philippines has really found its time, particularly in fintech. So being based here while operating around the region has been a pretty exciting vantage point to watch the ecosystem grow.
Amazing. And one interesting thing I have to ask you, what was it like growing up and studying at UC Irvine? Were you a party? Were you studying a lot? What was that like?
Well, that's a funny question because my co-founder was a classmate at UC Irvine, but not just a classmate. We were in the same fraternity, and we went through rushing like the induction together. So certainly there was some partying. But actually, before UC Irvine, I actually grew up in Joshua Tree, California, which, when I was growing up there, was a very backwoods kind of small desert town, but has now become sort of the hipster paradise of California. And it is objectively a beautiful place, and it's a really interesting place to visit. But growing up, it did not have the it's funny to go back there because growing up, it did not have the appeal that it did now. It was just seen as a small desert community with like a very bizarre national park behind the scenes. But UC Irvine was great. I mean, Irvine itself is a very suburban community, but it's actually surrounded by and is mostly a part of Newport Beach. And Newport Beach is an incredible place to live when you're of college age. And most of my time at UC Irvine was spent in a beach house with friends. And it was a really great experience. Academics, I have to say the first couple of years I was more focused on social scene than academics. I think it's fair to say I didn't blow it, but I was much more concerned with being involved socially and through my fraternity. But I studied abroad all of my third year and actually half of my fourth year of college in Europe and studying with an international crowd, focusing on economic development and international studies. And that's what really kind of got me sorted professionally and got me a lot more focused on, what I consider to be important from a kind of professional and personal development perspective. So coming back after having lived in France and in Spain, and then having interned at NATO in Belgium, and really focusing on economic development policy, I came back much more focused on wanting to, with I would say bigger aspirations, but also more focus on kind of why the studying and the professional skill development mattered to me personally.
Yeah. And, there's an interesting piece where, you had really focused on economics, international studies, public policy, and you were going down that track, right? Because you had a Peace Corps as a community economic advisor. And then, and you're kind of hinting at that, right? Because you then became part of strategy and you became a consultant like me as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's where you're kind of hinting with that skill set change.
Yeah.
Talk us through that transition, why you decided to become a consultant at that point of time.
Yeah, well, I left university thinking I was going to be a diplomat or involved in government. I'm always thinking about economic development policy, right? Making sure that there's an even playing field, that there's policies in place that encourage wealth generation, that encourage investment, and you know, I saw that through working in State Department and thinking through economic development policies in places like Afghanistan, but then also while I was in Peace Corps in the Dominican Republic, and the DR is a small country, 8-9 million people in the Caribbean, but it's GDP per capita wise, it's pretty similar to a country like Indonesia or Philippines or Vietnam. So large and growing and young consumer population, but still lots of families, especially outside the city center, struggling to make ends meet. And you know, I remember an anecdote where, you know, several people in the community where I lived were, there's a term in Dominican Spanish called chiripeo, which is basically going from odd job to odd job, right? So you'll do 2 weeks of construction, and then it's the avocado harvest, so 2 weeks of the avocado harvest, and then you're working for your brother's company because he needs he needs extra man hours, and then, but there's no financial security. And meanwhile, if there was an industrial plant that opened up, or if there was services work available, there would be 2,000 CVs coming in, right? And I think what I realized is having financial stability has downstream impact in terms of building a credit score, being able to build savings, being able to reliably work towards financial goals. You don't have to take drastic decisions like pulling your kids out of school if finances are tight, because you can actually plan ahead versus the chiripeo hopping from job to job. So that had an impact on me significantly in thinking about how to to support an economy that allows even the mass population to find meaningful work, and that can sustain them, and so that they can start to plan and build and build wealth and build and stability for their family. So it was from Peace Corps that I said, look, I want to continue working in policy. That brought me to Harvard Kennedy School, where I studied my master in public policy, but with a real focus on kind of economic development policy. I considered going into government full-time after grad school or nonprofit sector. But I think a big takeaway from my time previously was that working for a business or building a business that can have direct impact on the emerging market problems that matter can actually be more impactful and with direct impact, because you're creating jobs, you're creating economic stability, versus from the government or nonprofit side. And so I think that was my big takeaway. I figured the next step in skill development would be management consulting, and I think a lot of people choose management consulting for this reason, which is, and it's true. There are few jobs out of grad school that provide such a strong set of professional skills. Right now, whether people choose to be a lifetime management consultant and kind of go through the partner track, that's a decision on its own. But I think for 2 to 3 years, and I ended up doing about 3 years and change post grad school, I think tremendous development in terms of exposure to industries, exposure to different problems to solve, exposure to stakeholder management, and understanding different people in an organization. And they're thinking about themselves, they're thinking about the colleagues that they trust, the bosses that they've been loyal to. They have pride in what they've built, even if their team or their product is now potentially outdated, right? And so there's real organizational and personal dynamics involved as well that you really have to just learn through experience. And so I found that really, really valuable. I did 2 years in New York. Now this was 2012 to 2015, so a lot of it was cost transformation projects for large corporates in the US. But then after that, for a number of reasons, made a transfer internally out to Southeast Asia, and maybe we can talk about that later on.
Yeah, and why is that? So because you decide to do that transfer to KL, and then after that you start working and focusing not just in KL but also the Philippines and also across Singapore and the rest of Southeast Asia as well. So walk us through what was that rationale to say, these are the geographies. There's America, Then there was like the emerging markets, kind of like, outside America. And then to be Southeast Asia is the place that I'm focusing on.
Yeah.
What
You
was
know,
that
so
reasons for you?
yeah, there are there, you know, I've watched Steve Jobs' commencement speech so many times, and his point about connecting the dots retrospectively, I think, is so valid, because it's hard to put the dots together at the time, but looking back, I can see how it was a confluence of factors, all of which were pointing me in a single direction. I think number one was I had been working and was professionally motivated to be involved in emerging economies. Chaotic, yes. Complicated, yes. I'm certainly an outsider, yes, but exciting growth opportunities, exciting impact on social and economic development, and what I had studied and it related to my professional experiences. And so working domestically out of New York, I did a bit of work in Latin America, but most of it was based in, kind of East Coast US. And I was eager to get back to emerging economies and where arguably there's greater impact as a consultant or even outside consulting. Secondly, personally, my girlfriend at the time, now wife, is Filipina. We met at grad school at Harvard, and kind of we were back and forth between New York and I think deciding whether or not do we stay put in the US? Do we do something else? The third thing was I had been in touch with a partner at my firm who was the head of the public sector practice in Asia. He was based out of KL. And so we had been coordinating for years, just very casually on, yes, my profile is interesting to him. Yes, he's looking for a right team. He wants to bring me out on a secondment. And then I got a call end of 2014. And he said, look, congratulations, you just got promoted to engagement manager. We really need managers out here in Southeast Asia. We have all these really exciting clients lined up, but it's got to be a transfer. That's the only way I can get approval for it. So sorry to put you on the spot, Todd, but you have to decide, do you really want to come out here, or were you just kind of flirting with the idea intellectually? And so basically I had a week or so to make a decision, and 3 months later I was on a one-way flight from JFK over to KL, and that was the beginning of 2015. So it was a mix of personal, professional, and kind of an intellectual eagerness to get back into emerging economies. And I had not lived in Southeast Asia before, but certainly had studied and was familiar with the region, and was excited at the chance of working with this new team within the same firm. So I wasn't taking a completely new risk, but it was a lot of unknowns.
Definitely. And thanks for, being so frank and direct and actually concise about why you chose to move, right? Which is that confluence of like, you're open to it, you had a personal relationship that was important to you, and the fact that there was that opportunity that came up together. Of course, there's a big difference because a lot of people move to Southeast Asia, but not everyone stays, right? And not
Yeah.
everyone stays and chooses to become an entrepreneur in Southeast Asia. So you're almost like doubling or even say tripling down, right, on the region, right? Because if you double down for 2 more years by staying on as a consultant, you can leave anytime from Southeast Asia.
Yep.
You work at Google, Facebook, you can always rotate anytime to the US or another market. But to choose to be a founder means you're committing, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, to the region at minimum. And by that point of time, it's pretty much forever, right?
Yeah.
So walk us through how you made the decision to say, like, this is something that I want to double down and say, I'm going to be outside the consulting world. I'm going to build a professional career and even become a founder in Southeast Asia.
Yeah. So I think, in management consulting, in the large professional services, so whether it's management consulting, in banking, even if you're with a large law firm, I think it is healthy periodically to just understand what your options are, right? And in at least speaking from consulting, I think it's as you're at the point where you're shifting from kind of manager level to the partner track, I think that it's a different job, right? And being a partner at a firm where you're responsible for bringing in clients and managing clients, as opposed to managing projects and delivering the projects and kind of doing the analysis, right? Your job in a management consulting firm changes, right? So after a year or so in KL with Booz and Company, which at that point was strategy and after they were acquired by PwC, I just took a few headhunter calls, recruiter calls, just to see what's out there, right? And I spoke with a few startups, and I spoke with a family office, an investment fund based out of Manila, and the role offered was really interesting because it was, I saw it as brand new skill development, while also leveraging what I had learned, over the last few years. And basically, it was supporting the head of the fund to do two things. Kind of 25% or so of my time would be helping them look at deals, primarily early stage tech deals, so investments, right? And I had not done that before, but learning the process of how a potential investment is evaluated was new to me, but super interesting. And then 75% was running as interim COO of one of their portfolio companies where they needed some execs to come in and help steer the ship. And it was basically a software company supporting telco in the Philippines. And the role was one, kind of protecting the legacy business, which is very much a cash cow situation, right? So kind of mature industry, declining revenues, but still very healthy margins, and just something that needed to be protected until it didn't make sense financially anymore. But also building new businesses out of the assets and the relationships that company had. So we brought new business to Myanmar, which at the time in 2015 was a brand new telco market. The Myanmar government had just released new telco licenses, and then building out some mobile marketing services as well. Anyway, I give that context because, so I spent a year there, but while I was there, I very quickly started thinking about, I'm looking at tech deals in the region. I'm getting more and more excited about the startups that are coming across the table. I'm directly involved in supporting new products being developed from this organization. I started to think, okay, what if I were to start from scratch and build something and tackle a problem and put the right team around it, and kind of go for it, right? And so around that time, I started making some phone calls, again, just to explore, right? Just to say, let's validate the option, see if something's there, see if there's actually a real possibility here. And one of my first phone calls was to Ken, my now co-founder. And as I said, Ken and I know each other from college back at UC Irvine. He was in computer science, I was in economics. We met through the fraternity almost 2 decades ago at this point. And he used to live in Manila and had been based in Jakarta for several years. And I called him just for developer recommendations. I said, Ken, I'm thinking about building something new. I haven't done it before, but I know that I need someone technical because I come from a kind of management and economics background. And he said, yeah, I can recommend some people, but what do you have in mind? Because I had no idea when I reached out to him, but he was also freelancing at the time. And working as a technical consultant. So, had I not made that call, had I not chosen to at least explore opportunities, I wouldn't have found out that Ken was also kind of thinking about starting something. So that started a conversation about, what are some ideas, what's top of mind, kind of where we are in terms of life stages, right? I had just gotten married, he had just had his first kid, and kind of a lot was lining up. And so we went kind of at the end of 2016, we went for it. And certainly that's gone through many iterations and difficulties, but that's part of the risk you take by saying, by jumping into a new venture.
Amazing. And how did that conversation happen, right? Because, you had to have that conversation with your old frat brother.
Yeah.
Obviously it makes it easier and harder at the same point of time, right?
Yep.
So how did that conversation happen because I think a lot of people out there are always thinking to themselves, like, how do I get a co-founder, right? How do
Yeah.
I reconnect with a friend or something like that? How did that conversation happen? What were the difficult parts of the conversation? What were the easier parts of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. so first of all, neither of us called the other one to start a startup. I called him literally because I was asking for if he has any developers that he knows and recommends. And there was no ulterior motive other than, can I trust your judgment on software engineers? Is there anybody in Manila that you recommend, right? And he was eager to hear what I was thinking about. But I think from the beginning, he recognized quite transparently that that he wanted to, if he wanted to start something, a new business, that he would need a co-founder or a partner as well, and that he really wanted to be focused on the technical system design and building an engineering team. And of course, I have zero capability to do that, right? And I think that was so it was a very kind of it was several conversations and a trip to Jakarta, but it was a very transparent conversation about several conversations about what our motivations were, what our interests were, what was motivating. I think the other thing is, and I tell this to several, to friends and contacts that are considering starting a new business. There is a counterintuitive lesson that I've learned, and maybe it doesn't apply to everyone, but it certainly holds true for me and for Ken and myself. It's so important to have complementarity when you're entering into a business partnership. Meaning, it is essential that you're bringing different skills to the table. Number one, because then two heads are better than one. But number two, it reduces the chance of overlap, and it reinforces the fact that you need to trust each other's professional judgment, right? If it were two economics majors trying to figure out fintech in Southeast Asia, then certainly we would be butting heads on kind of certain decisions and ignorant or naive on other decisions, right? Meaning we both have the same blind spots and we both have the same, strong opinions, right? But if you have a business partner or a co-founder that brings very complementary strengths, then what you can achieve together, and the kind of from an ego or a domain expertise perspective, I think it allows for you to run a lot faster and a lot more effectively from day one. And that's one thing I appreciate about the partnership with Ken, is that I think we both recognize each other's abilities and strengths, and we operate as a team rather than kind of a two-headed, I don't know how to describe it, but we operate as a team because we recognize we bring different skills together.
Amazing. And complementarity is important, and I think that's so underrated because there's so many founders we know who are looking for people who are exactly alike, right? Because it's
It's human
easier.
nature. We want to
Yeah.
associate ourselves with people who share the same interests, who come from common backgrounds, right? And Ken and I do have common background, and that's sort of the relationship glue that's held us, together through the difficult times. But you're right. The reason I mention this is because I think it is counterintuitive, right? Just because they're a buddy does not mean that good co-founders it will make, right? It really needs to bring complementary skill sets that together can drive fast and effective decision making.
Yeah. And I would love to ask, so how does two former frat brothers, now founders, who are complementary to each other, how do you hash out problems with each other? Do you go out for beer pong? That's one way.
Well,
How do you hash out a problem, I guess?
yeah, it's a good question, and it's more complicated because I'm based in Manila, he's based in Jakarta, and one of the very first conversations was were us being very clear that if we do this, it has to be a distributed first team, and we actually both recognize that this is This is pre-COVID, all of that, right? But I think we recognized early on, if we're going to, number one, because of personal circumstances, I wasn't planning to move to Jakarta, he wasn't planning to move back to Manila. If we're going to do this, we have to make distributed work. And yes, there can be travel and whatnot, but distributed needs to work. But number two, I think we recognized day one that, especially building an engineering team, it would be beneficial actually to source talent from across the region rather than just building a development center in Jakarta or in Manila or somewhere else. And I think I'm glad we made that decision. And some of our best staff are outside of major cities that if we were localized or centralized, physically centralized, we wouldn't have an opportunity to get them, or we'd have to convince them to move, right? So, so sometimes virtual beers, certainly. I mean, pre-COVID, I would be traveling a lot to Jakarta. He would travel as well. We make time. I think number one is we make sure that we are each of I'll be speaking for Ken a little bit, but I think we make each other extremely accessible to the other, right? So basically, if he and I need to work through something, good or bad, right? But if we need to work through something, like the other one takes priority if we need to be in communication. So that and the result of which is we are in a constant stream of discussion, whether it's through WhatsApp or getting on video calls, or through Slack or whatever, throughout the day, right? So I think just having that constant stream of communication as if we were seated next to each other, right? I think is fundamental. It's kind of obvious, but it's fundamental and really important. I think number two is appreciating where each of us have respective domain expertise and deferring to decisions based on who has more credibility in that domain, right? That's about as simple as I can say it, which is, it would be silly for me to undermine. I will disagree sometimes, but like ultimately an engineering decision, a technology choice, an engineering, HR decision related to developers, I have to trust his judgment, because he may not be 100% the right decision, but it's going to be more likely to be the right decision than if I were to make it, right? And I think the same goes for some of the areas where I'm the most focused, on the business development, on the kind of the overall team and corporate affairs side, outside of engineering, right? So I think recognizing and respecting the domain expertise that each founder brings to the table, and having a healthy discussion, but ultimately deferring to the counterpart who is kind of most credible or most likely to have the best judgment, I think is a recipe for success more often than not.
One interesting aspect is, of course, your focus on distributed teaming before it became cool / inevitable / mandatory.
Yeah.
Talk us through about, obviously, you said how you were lucky to do that. How do you see that, trending in the future? Is it the future is all distributed? How does that play out from your perspective?
Yeah, well, we've all experienced it, right? Even though that most of us have experienced it. Even if they didn't even if their company wasn't distributed, it was kind of forced distributed. Those of us who work in offices, right? Of course, healthcare workers and other service workers, that they've been carrying the torch. But I of course speak with bias towards kind of office workers, right? That have the privilege of being able to work from home. No, I think there is, and this has been the case since we started, there are differing points of view about how to make remote work successful, or even if remote work is healthy, right? I think it is a healthy debate because there isn't black and white, right? So I remember the founder of Plaid, Zach Parrott, did a whole blog post or a Twitter feed or something on the importance of having camera off Zoom meetings. Why? Because he talked about how studies show that it can be stressful having your camera on all day, and it creates anxiety, and it actually creates fatigue, right? And he said, look, no, you got to give people the option to be camera off, and in fact, you should reinforce camera off for certain meetings, right? And I can find you 100 other articles of people saying, absolutely, camera on is the way that you build rapport and see expressions and pick up on nonverbals, and the indirect communication is so important in Southeast Asia, so having camera on is essential, right? So it's a healthy debate, super healthy debate, right? Personally, and as a founder, as a founder in Southeast Asia, the most valuable part of having a distributed team is you can find phenomenal colleagues outside of major cities. It very simply, right? And these are people that, for personal reasons, for lifestyle choice reasons, they're not going to migrate into central Jakarta. They're going to stay in Bandung, or they're going to stay in Bali, and I think that is phenomenal, and it's healthy, right? Now the challenge, Jeremy, is you have to then change your HR recruiting practices to screen for people who have the mindset towards productive remote work, right? I don't want to be too biased or sound too biased here, but it does involve a certain sense of emotional maturity and independence to be able to be accountable for your work, even if there's not somebody physically looking over your shoulder, right? So I think in Southeast Asia, managing a technology company, the benefits far outweigh the difficulties of remote working. But I mean, for me, I truly cannot see it any other way. And putting, I mean, just also like putting product managers and developers onto public transport for an hour or two to go into the office and on a fixed schedule when some are super early birds or super night owls, right? It just, from a first principles perspective, it doesn't make sense. Maybe it does in other cities, but in Southeast Asia, I think the remote model is phenomenal.
Amazing. I totally agree about the debate and the first order principles about what makes sense. What's interesting, of course, is that there's a lot of benefit, especially for people, for example, in the Philippines, right, or Indonesia, where historically they could only get jobs, for example, from local companies, right, that had office, and now they are able to get remote jobs from Philippine startups, but also regional startups that's the remote. But also, I think we're starting to see now what I call the MNC, multinational corporation 2.0, where Facebook, Google, Series A startups in the US, Series B, that are willing to raise capital, but also look for talent globally, and as a result, see that. So I think this is an interesting kind of like dynamic where there's an auction, or salaries are going up, right? Because now there are multiple employers possible as a result of this remote, which is, I think, a good thing. I'm just wondering if you see
Definitely.
that.
Well, and the biggest, so so I agree with what you're saying. To me, it sounds like retention challenges, because it's even more reasons for our best staff to get poached by a company that is now setting up APAC operations, or now allows for, it's a US company, but has a whole team now working Asia hours, right? And the biggest difficulty are actually the crypto companies, because they operate globally, they operate 24/7. Many of them choose not to operate out of the West for various reasons, and it's practically the ethos of crypto companies to be distributed as part of their decentralization kind of way of working, right, and mentality. So that as the crypto economy has grown and crypto companies are grown globally, not just in Asia, I think that's been a direct threat to tech companies operating in Southeast Asia. And I imagine other founders would agree with me and are experiencing the same. Also, to say nothing of the fact that salaries are crazy. and because of all of the capital coming into crypto. And so basically, um, you're getting really good staff that are able to get multiples of what is already a quite attractive salary. But yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's a day-to-day challenge we're all facing at the moment.
Well, it's good for the employee slash global nomad now who's has a relative low cost of living and maybe is American-ish kind of like discount to that kind
Yep.
of salary is a nice sweet spot, I think, for a lot of folks. Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting challenges for a lot of startups in the region would just be like kind of like stuck in that uh, dilemma in that sense, right? In terms of how do you kind of like compete for talent on a global and regional and local stage simultaneously. On that note, I'd love to kind of like go into hearing a little bit more about kind of like the ups and downs of because you've also grown as a company, right? You've kind of grown not just as a founder but also as a leader of an executive of the company through multiple funding rounds as well. um, could you share with us a little bit more about your reflections about your personal change as a leader over that time?
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's a good question. Well, I think the main so professionally, the biggest change or kind of personal development that I've undergone is shifting from operator to manager. And the when you're starting a company and it's just you and your co-founder, you are every function in the company, right? You are every function in the company. You are CFO, you are head of sales, you are COO, you are, I had a CTO, so I wasn't CTO, right? But like, who's head of product? It's kind of between Ken and I, right? All the corporate functions, all the front office functions, that's me, right? So I'm doing everything. I'm accountable for everything. I'm thinking about the details of how to execute on everything. And then you hire people little by little who are helping with tasks. There may be leading a particular piece of the function, but you're still, you still have your hands on practically every part of the operation that, I have my hands on every part of the operation that's not handled by my co-founder, right? Which in our case is very black and white. He's handling the engineering and I'm handling everything that's not the engineering, right? But as we're now, a staff of 110 people and we have a whole, bench of really, really expert leaders, it's a very different, my role is very different now. It's, my bias is still towards being very close to the day-to-day operations, and I certainly need to be, but shifting to a role where I'm thinking about how to ensure longevity, how do I ensure that people are taken care of, how do we make sure that we're making the right choices strategically, how do we engage investors and external partners, while trusting that the operations are being handled, but also stepping in when the operations need adjustment, right? So again, this sounds a bit obvious, but I think it's tremendously difficult. I mean, we're 5 years in, right? And the first 3 of those 5 years, it was basically me running it, right? And I'm not running it anymore. I'm managing it, but I'm relying on a team of experts that are really running day-to-day operations, right? Of course, I'm accountable for it, but I have to rely on a team, and I have to make sure that team is set up for success. So that's challenging from a skill development point of view, but it's also challenging from a personal letting go point of view, right? And empowering the team to make the right decisions, and even if those decisions are have their own flavor that are maybe different than I would have done it, and that's okay because the end result is better than it would have been if I had just been micromanaging every piece. So that's a challenge. I think appreciating the fact that I am a bule, as they say in Indonesia. I'm an outsider. I did not grow up here. I'm not Southeast Asian. I do not have excellent Bahasa Indonesia or Tagalog skills as much as I would like to. I definitely don't have Thai or Vietnamese skills, right, or Mandarin. So, and as an American, there are distinct cultural differences. I mean, Americans are proud to be direct and frank and confrontational in an intellectual, well, sometimes literally confrontational, but confrontational in a kind of put problems on the table kind of way, right? And I don't think it's, you know, stereotyping to say, like, Southeast Asia conflict resolution takes place in a very different way typically, right? And so learning that and respecting you know, feedback from colleagues, you know, having kind of the humility to learn that you know concerns or conflicts or disagreements can be handled in a different way than the typical American style. I think that's been a steep learning curve, but something that I've appreciated, and hopefully I have a little bit better radar now than I did 5 years ago. Yeah, so those are some of the learnings, I think.
Amazing. And on that note, could you share about a time that you have been brave?
Yeah, I mean, the the I would say, when I think of a brave moment, it's the moment or series of moments early on in Brankas when everyone was trying to convince me and convince Ken that this was a terrible idea. Colleagues were telling me that this is a highly regulated industry, it's a highly cartelized industry, and disruptive financial services is, you know, dead on arrival at best and opening up to litigation or criminal issues at worst. And anyway, we're not locals and we don't have local connections, so forget about it, right? No, in the sense that, you know, fintech infrastructure and open finance is too early for Southeast Asia, that it doesn't apply to Southeast Asia, that it's just not, the market's not ready. The no from, you know, investors saying that Ken and I do not have the track record together or individually to make this a reality. The no from potential hires that said, no, we don't want to join Brankas, we'll join somewhere else where we have another company. You just get no's all the time. No's from customers, no's from investors, no's from family members, no's from friends, no's from potential recruits. And so it requires a bit of, you know, being brave to say, we've thought this through, we're going to give it a shot, we're going to be persistent, we're going to validate whether or not this has been true, and potentially, if this is successful, and Brankas is definitely still a work in progress, but if it's successful, I mean, it will be successful because others considered it too hard to do, right? And because if it were easy, an incumbent would have done it already, or somebody else would have come in already, right? So I think and this is really the founder dilemma for anyone, is to, in the face of a bunch of no's, you know, to persist and say, we're going to see this out for a period of time and validate whether or not there's actually something there. And trusting your judgment, trusting your own analysis, trusting in your own abilities, even if people say you're not capable, and saying, no, we're going to try.
Amazing. I just think that there's a lot of truth there. And how do you tell the difference between when everyone tells you that it's a bad idea and it is a bad idea versus everyone tells you it's a bad idea and is an idea that can work if you execute well enough, right? So how would you reflect that? Because I'm sure you've met a lot of founders who've given you other ideas as well.
Yep.
And you've given your own 2 cents. I've been in those shoes as well. So
Yeah.
what would you say?
There are, I think it's when I receive advice or judgment from someone, I try to think how I try to think about what is the point of view that they're coming from. And someone coming from the traditional financial services industry saying this can't be done, well, they have an interest in the status quo and they've been working inside the system, so to speak, right? So, you know, I appreciate that feedback. I recognize that it's going to be hard, but, you know, you have to understand that they have a lens through which they're viewing the world, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a category of advice or advice givers where they are telling you their opinion based on their vantage point versus they're giving you an opinion based on similar research in the space. I'm getting tongue-tied here. Let me try and articulate it a different way. So yeah, it's a difficult challenge to separate the no's that are coming from a biased point of view versus the no's that are coming from a really credible point of view, right? And I think I try and think of them each as a data point, right? And one data point may be someone coming from a traditional bank or traditional financial institution, and they say, yeah, you know, this is going to be really difficult based on my view from kind of the, you know, the existing industry. You know, but you take each as a data point, and if there are a lot of credible data points saying, Todd, you have a blind spot here, right? And they're coming from a point of view that is fact-based and credible based on their own experience, then that's worth taking a look at, right? But there are, you know, advice and opinions are easy to come by, and you know, we could give our opinions all day long, but some opinions are more credible than others, right? And so having that lens to say, you know, this person is giving a feedback and they really know what they're talking about from a big picture point of view versus this person is giving feedback and they're coming from a very particular point of view. And so thank you. I will take that data point that people from this cohort might have this point of view, right? You know, and I'll give you an example, right? Like up until a couple of years ago, investors from the West, right, the US or even most of Europe, were not deploying capital into Southeast Asia, right? They considered Southeast Asia too small, too early stage. If they were looking at emerging markets, they were looking at China or India, right? And they said Southeast Asia is fragmented, unstable, too early, doesn't make sense, right? I literally got that feedback from basically unanimously from San Francisco-based VCs in 2018. Now, they're not wrong. These are super successful venture capital firms, right? But their vantage point was they have plenty of deal flow in the US. They don't understand the dynamics of the Southeast Asia market. They're not an emerging markets focused fund. They're a US focused fund. And so of course they're going to say that Southeast Asia seems too weird, right? So if I had taken only their advice, because Silicon Valley is the hub of venture capital, you know, then that would have been a incomplete view of the opportunity, right? And so the same goes for getting advice about a startup or a new business idea, which is, you know, advice is easy to come by, but some of that advice will be incomplete. And so it's up to you to string those data points together and build your own complete picture.
Amazing. Awesome. And when you think about the complete picture, you know, in your last 1 minute here, when you think about a complete picture, how do you form the complete picture versus, you know, all the people who are bullish for you versus all the people who are bearish on you, right? Because like you said, they're fragmented on the region, they're fragmented on being a founder, they're fragmented on the system. How do you make that final call on, you know, the complete picture?
Well, one is just making sure that I'm doing more listening than opining myself, right? I recognize the irony because I've just been talking for the last hour on this podcast. But in general, making sure that I'm doing listening, whether it's with colleagues, whether it's with customers, whether it's with partners, whether it's investors, and just making sure that I'm not jumping to conclusions even about Brankas, where I've been laser focused the last 5 years and making sure that I'm open to feedback, right? Again, that feedback may be incomplete, but it's a good data point. And so just recognizing and maintaining a bit of self-awareness of like, am I doing more talking than listening? Do I have confirmation bias and I'm not, no longer listening to someone who's trying to convey a message to me? Basically, am I being stubborn, right? So having that mindset and just making sure that I continue to absorb information, I think is valuable, and probably is even more valuable now than it was years ago.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Todd. On that note, I'd love to recap the three aspects that I found kind of like popped out as themes. So the first is thank you so much for, I think, consistently showing what I call the learning curve as a founder. So I think how you learned about yourself in terms of your own career of not being a diplomat and choosing to build out that skill set as a consultant. And eventually actually also how you learned about the geography or markets that you wanted to be at, both from a professional way, but also which country that you wanted to be in on a personal and professional aspect. Well, and also how you as a founder learned how to figure out the complete picture, right, in decision making across the different advisors. So really interesting to see how you draw out that learning curve, right, multiple times. So really interesting there. The second one is really about thank you so much for sharing about your what I call like complementary distributed teaming. So at one level, we talked about it in terms of like, yes, you did meet your co-founder in terms of having run across them as frat brothers. So that's pulling your leg a little bit there. Well, on the other hand, it's more like you would have found that person because you're going through that past networks because you're looking for that complementary person. So I think that was really a deeper insight there. And I think you kind of emphasize that again and again about how you distributed the team, what you're looking at, how you saw that opportunity. And we talked about some of the second order impacts of that happening as well. And lastly, thanks so much for also sharing about a set of decisions you talked about Southeast Asia. I think you talked about different facets of it. You talked about, on one level, you talked about it in the aspect of it as an emerging market from when you were inside America. You talked about it in Southeast Asia as a home that you made for yourself and your now wife. Congratulations, as a place to make home. And you also talked about Southeast Asia as a place to work for so many of your teammates, as a place of competition. You talk about Southeast Asia as a decision for venture capital. So lots of different aspects that you have there, and it's really exciting to see how you've articulated that for so many different people to think about. So again, thank you so much, Todd, for coming on the Brave podcast.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I had a great time.